ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जायमुदीरये। नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवतसेवया भगवतीरुत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी। ॐ अज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकय चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकदा मह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकं। नमो विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामीनिति नामिने। नमस्ते सरस्वते देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्यदेशतारिणे। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभो नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। Hare Krishna. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. We are reading from Canto 3, Chapter 4, Vidura approaches Maitreya. So we are in the final section of the chapter where Uddhava is narrating, and Shukadeva Goswami is narrating Uddhava's going towards Vadrikashram. So we are at text 32. Yeah, please can you go through?
Translation. Sukadeva Goswami informed the king that Uddhava, being thus instructed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the source of all Vedic knowledge and the spiritual master of the three worlds, reached the pilgrimage site of Badrikashram and engaged himself there in trance to satisfy the Lord. Purport. Lord Sri Krishna is factually the spiritual master of the three worlds, and he is the original source of all Vedic knowledge. It is very difficult, however, to understand the personal feature of the absolute truth, even from the Vedas. His personal instructions are needed in order to understand the personality of Godhead as the supreme absolute truth. Bhagavad Gita is the evidence of such transcendental knowledge in jest. One cannot know the Supreme Lord unless one is graced by the Lord Himself. Lord Krishna exhibited this specific mercy towards Arjuna and Uddhava while he was in the material world. Undoubtedly, Bhagavad Gita was spoken by the Lord on the battlefield of Kurukshetra just to encourage Arjuna to fight. And yet, to complete the transcendental knowledge of Bhagavad Gita, the Lord instructed Uddhava. The Lord wanted Uddhava to fulfill his mission and disseminate knowledge which he had not spoken even in Bhagavad Gita. Persons who are attached to the words of the Vedas may also know from this verse that the Lord is the source of all Vedic knowledge. One who is unable to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead by going through the pages of the Vedas may take shelter of one of the Lord's devotees, such as Uddhava, in order to advance further in knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Brahma Samhita says that it is very difficult to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead from the Vedas, but he is easily understood from a pure devotee like Uddhava. Taking mercy on the great sages who lived at Badrikashram, the Lord authorized Uddhava to speak on his behalf. Unless one has such authorization, one cannot understand or preach the devotional service of the Lord. While present on this earth, the Lord executed many uncommon activities, even traveling in space to bring down the Parijata from heaven and recovering the son of his teacher, Sandipani Muni, from the regions of death. Uddhava was certainly informed of the conditions of life on other planets, and all the sages were anxious to know of them, just as we are anxious to know about the planets in space. Uddhava was particularly deputed to carry a message to Badrikashram, not only to the sages of that place of pilgrimage, but also to the Nara Narayana deities. Such a message must have been more confidential than the knowledge described in the pages of the Vedas. The Lord is undoubtedly the source of all knowledge, and the messages dispatched through Uddhava to Naranarayana and other sages were also part of the Vedic knowledge. But they were more confidential and could be sent or understood only through such a pure devotee as Uddhava. Since such conditional knowledge was known only to the Lord and Uddhava, it is said that Uddhava was as good as the Lord himself. Every living entity can, like Uddhava, also become a confidential messenger on the same level as the Lord, provided he becomes confidential himself by dint of loving devotional service. Such confidential knowledge is entrusted as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita only to pure devotees like Uddhava and Arjuna. And one has to learn the mystery through them and not otherwise. One cannot understand Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam without the help of such confidential devotees of the Lord. According to Srila Vishwanatha Chakravarti Thakur, that confidential message must have concerned the mystery of his departure and the annihilation of his dynasty after the end of his appearance in the mundane world for 100 years. Everyone must have been very anxious to know about the mystery of the annihilation of the Yadu dynasty, and that message must have been explained by the Lord to Uddhava and dispatched to Badrikashram for the information of Naranarayana and other pure devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.
Text 32. Shukadeva Goswami informed the king, Maharaj Parikshit, that Uddhava, thus instructed by the Supreme Lord, reached the pilgrimage site of Badrikashram and engaged there in trance to satisfy the Lord. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada writes that Lord Krishna is to understand the Supreme Lord through Vedas is very difficult. Brahma Samhita very clearly says, Vedeshu durlabham adurlabham atma bhakto. That to understand the Supreme Lord through Vedas is very difficult and it's a Herculean task. And therefore, to understand the Supreme Lord and to understand his personal instructions, one has to go through a Guru Shishya Parampara. Arjuna and Uddhava were very specially fortunate because they were directly instructed by the Lord. Arjuna was instructed through Bhagavad Gita, and Bhagavad Gita was a emergency literature, emergency speech extempore by the Lord. Lord did not give very confidential knowledge about the performance of devotional service in Bhagavad Gita, and therefore Prabhupada says, Lord completed the knowledge of Bhagavad Gita by instructions to Uddhava, which is part of Uddhava Gita that we are going to study in 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is how the Lord gave the complete message through Bhagavad Gita and through Uddhava Gita. And this is the speciality of the instruction of the Supreme Lord. Now the instructions of the Supreme Lord can be accessed through the via medium of a devotee. And therefore Prabhupada says one must take shelter of such a devotee as Uddhava, or in the Guru Shishya Parampara, such a devotee as Srila Prabhupada and disciples of Srila Prabhupada. In that, living Guru Shishya Parampara is very important. Otherwise, it will become very difficult to understand the Supreme Lord and the message of the Supreme Lord. Srila Prabhupada says one needs such an authorization. Now, while being on earth, Supreme Lord, he performed many wonderful uncommon activities. And some of the uncommon activities were travel through the outer planets and the space travel. Srila Prabhupada gives reference to the space travel, traveling to the heavenly planets to get the Parijata tree, and traveling to get the sons of Sandipani Muni. And whereas people are very anxious and excited about the life on other planets, entire the modern day Elon Musk's, the entire mission Mars and everything is just about finding what's happening outside. Okay. So just like people are excited now, people were excited at that time as well. And Uddhava had all the information because Uddhava was a direct disciple of Brihaspati and very, very confidential devotee of the Lord. And therefore, Uddhava was particularly given the task of giving a very confidential information not only to the sages of Naimisharanya but also to the personality Naranarayan Rishi themselves. So, the deities of Naranarayan Rishi. And such a message was extremely confidential and which is not to be understood from the pages of Vedas but through the association of pure devotee. Vedeshu Durlabham, Adurlabham Atma Bhakta. The Supreme Lord is Durlabh, very, very rare to be obtained through Vedas. But Adurlabham is very easily obtained through Atma Bhakta, through such a confidential devotee as Uddhava or Arjuna or Srila Prabhupada. Okay, right, in the disciplic succession. The Lord is, Prabhupada says, undoubtedly the source of all knowledge, and the message was dispatched through Uddhava to Naranarayan Rishi, and that message must be extremely confidential. Now, the very, very confidential message is not text or sent on a voice note, it is sent through personality messenger. And therefore, Uddhava must have been, Prabhupada says, a very great devotee because such a confidential message was sent through Uddhava. Not only this time, even Lord wanted to send message to gopis of Vrindavan. Lord sent it through Uddhava. So Uddhava was a very, very highly confidential messenger of the Lord. And therefore, Uddhava, Prabhupada says, from that perspective, is as good as the Supreme Lord Himself. Because the message, the moment you carry the message without adulterating the message, you become, you go on the platform of, but of course, you not in the Mayavadi sense that one becomes the Lord, but the point is that he has to be respected as Lord. Right? Sakshat Haritvena Samasta Shastrai. Uktastatha. This is how we glorify spiritual master. Sakshat Haritvena. And Prabhupada says not only Uddhava, very beautiful line here. Like Uddhava, every living entity can also become the confidential messenger of on the same level as the Lord, provided he becomes confidential himself by the dint of loving devotional service. So this is the beauty of devotional service. Everybody can become the messenger of like Uddhava. And what is that we becoming messenger like Uddhava? It simply means one has to extend one's energies in book distribution. When one is carrying the message of Bhagavad Gita and distributing Bhagavad Gita, when one is distributing Krishna book, when one is distributing the message of the Lord, calling people for the Bhagavad Gita discourses, doing the follow up, whatever simple loving devotional service that we are doing, one is actually becoming as confidential as Uddhava. And then further Prabhupada says, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has written about what must have been the message which was personally given, carried by Uddhava to the sages of Naimisharanya and the deity of Naranarayan Rishi. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, the message must be the mystery of the departure of the Supreme Lord and annihilation of Yadu dynasty, because these were hugely bewildering and at times controversial even within the the understanding of the devotees. And therefore the Supreme Lord personally, he asked Uddhava to carry the message and deliver the message, and this message was about disappearance of the Lord, which is very, very mysterious and often misunderstood, and annihilation of the Yadu dynasty, which is also very mysterious and often misunderstood. Text 33. विदुरोऽपि उद्धवात् श्रुत्वा कृष्णस्य परमात्मनः क्रीडया उपात्तदेहस्य कर्माणि श्लाघितानि च. Translation.
Vidura
Translation.
also, oh, sorry.
Vidura also heard from Uddhava about the appearance and disappearance of Lord Krishna, the super soul, in the mortal world, which is a subject matter sought after with great perseverance by the great sages. Purport: the subject matter of the appearance and disappearance of the super soul, Lord Shri Krishna, is a mystery even for the great sages. The word Paramatmanaha is significant in this verse. An ordinary living being is generally called the Atma, but Lord Krishna is never an ordinary living being because he is Paramatma, the super soul. Yet his appearance as one of the human beings and his disappearance again from the mortal world are subject matters for the research workers who execute research work with great perseverance. Such subject matters are certainly of increasing interest because the researchers have to search out the transcendental abode of the Lord, which he enters after finishing his pastimes in the mortal world. But even the great sages have no information that beyond the material sky is the spiritual sky where Sri Krishna eternally resides with his associates, although at the same time he exhibits his pastimes in the mortal world in all the universes one after another. This fact is confirmed in the Brahma Samhita 5.37. Goloka Eva Nivasatye Akhilatma Bhutaha. The Lord, by his inconceivable potency, resides in his eternal abode, Goloka, yet at the same time, as a super soul, he is present everywhere in both the spiritual and material skies by his multi varieties of manifestation. Therefore, his appearance and disappearance are simultaneously going on, and no one can say definitely which of them is the beginning and which is the end. His eternal pastimes have no beginning or end, and one has to learn of them from the pure devotee only and not waste valuable time in so called research work. Hare Krishna.
Vidurasyapi Uddhavat Krishnasya Paramatmanah. Vidura also heard from Uddhava that the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna is Paramatma and the appearance and the disappearance of the pastimes, and which is very difficult even for the great sages to understand these pastimes of the Supreme Lord. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada describes that subject matter of appearance and disappearance of the Lord are bewildering even to the great sages. Muhyanti yatsureha. So they are always bewildering. So unless they are heard from the authorized devotees of the Lord, it is very difficult to understand these pastimes. And even Vidura, he understood these pastimes from Uddhava. So the Supreme Lord is called as Paramatma. So there is a Atma, there is a Paramatma, and Paramatma is much different than Atma. We have seen that Achintya Bheda Bheda, right? So Paramatma is Tasmat Kshara Atitoham Aksharadapi Chottama. Some of the Atmas, they are Nitya Baddha, they are in the material world, some are Nitya Siddha, most are Nitya Siddha, they are in the spiritual world. But the Supreme Lord is beyond Kshara and Akshara, and he is beyond, he is the super soul. And this pastime of appearance and the disappearance of the Supreme Lord is very mysterious. Why? Because there is not one point that Lord appears and disappears. Prabhupada says, just like the sunrise and sunset. What is the sunrise time? Oh, sunrise time may be 7 o'clock at our place, but every minute the sun is rising somewhere across the globe, and every minute the sun is setting somewhere. Every minute sun is rising, every minute sun is setting. Simultaneously sun is rising, simultaneously that very moment sun is setting somewhere. Similarly, the pastimes of the Lord, Prabhupada says, they go on continuously across the universes one after another. Okay, very beautiful understanding. So just like the sun, there is a sunrise and sunset at every given moment. Similarly, pastimes of the Supreme Lord, the sun is within one universe. Pastimes of the Supreme Lord across the Anantakoti Brahmandas, they are constantly happening. So somewhere is rising, somewhere is setting. So this is the beautiful pastimes. So therefore, the appearance and the disappearance, Prabhupada says, they go on simultaneously. Although the Supreme Lord is always situated in Goloka, Goloka eva nivasatti akhila atma bhuto. Whereas the sages try to understand this, but one of the biggest problem is that they do not have understanding that there is a spiritual sky beyond the material sky. Parastasmat tu bhavanyo vyakto vyaktat sanatanaha. So they are not aware of that understanding, parambhava majananto, and therefore they will keep on researching pages after pages, lifetime after lifetimes, but will not come to the factual understanding. And therefore, Prabhupada says one should not waste one's valuable time in so-called research work and simply follow the parampara system where the knowledge is described as it is. Factual knowledge is described as it is. So the next is a very beautiful verse. Next two verses are very, very beautiful. We'll recite this. Text 34. Dehanasam च तस्यैवम्
देहन्यासं च तत्रैवं
धीराणां धैर्यवर्धनम्
धीराणां
धीराणां
धैर्यवर्धनम्
धैर्यवर्धनम्
अन्येषां दुष्करतरम्
अन्येषां
अन्येषां
दुष्करतरं
पशूनां विक्लवात्मनाम्.
पशूनां
Translation.
the Lord's glorious acts and his acceptance of various transcendental forms for the performance of extraordinary pastimes in the mortal world are very difficult for anyone other than his devotees to understand, and for the best they are simply a mental disturbance. Purport. The transcendental forms and pastimes of the Lord, as described in Bhagavad Gita, are difficult subject matters for those who are not devotees to understand. The Lord never reveals himself to persons like the Gyanis and Yogis. And there are others who, because of their envying the Lord from the bottom of their hearts, are classified amongst the beasts. And for such envious beasts, the subject matter of the Lord's appearance and disappearance is simply a mental disturbance. As confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 7.15, the miscreants who are simply concerned with material enjoyment, who work very hard like beasts of burden, can hardly know the personality of Godhead at any stage due to asurika bhava, or a spirit of revolt against the Supreme Lord. The transcendental bodily expansions manifested by the Lord for his pastimes in the mortal world, and the appearance and disappearance of the law of such transcendental expansions are difficult subject matters, and those who are not devotees are advised not to discuss the Lord's appearance and disappearance, lest they commit further offenses at the lotus feet of the Lord. The more they discuss the transcendental appearance and disappearance of the Lord in the Asuric spirit, the more they enter into the darkest region of hell, as stated in Bhagavad Gita 16.20. Anyone who is against the transcendental loving service of the Lord is more or less a beastly creature, as confirmed in the verse of Srimad Bhagavatam.
Yeah, so very powerful verse this is. Dehanasyam cha tasyevam dhiranam dhairyavardhanam annisham cha dushkarataram pashunam viklavatmanam. The glorious acts of the Lord and his acceptance of the transcendental forms like Matsya, Varaha, the Kurma. For the performance of the extraordinary pastimes in the mortal world are very difficult for very difficult to understand for others than the devotees. And for the beasts, they are simply mental disturbance. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada write, transcendental forms and the pastimes, they are divine in nature. Janma karma cha me divyam. Evam yo vetti. So Janma and karma of the Supreme Lord, they are divyam. But unless one is a pure devotee of the Lord or following a pure devotee of the Lord in the Guru Shishya Parampara, it is very difficult to understand the pastimes of the Lord. The Lord never reveals to Gyanis or Yogis. The Lord is revealed only to the devotees. And if the Gyanis and Yogis cannot understand the Supreme Lord, what to speak of the personality who is like a beastly personality, Dvipada Pashu, one whose only interest is the material enjoyment and envy towards the Lord, it is extremely difficult. And Srila Prabhupada quotes here, Namam dushkrutino mudha prapadyante naradhama mayaya aparita jnana asuram bhavam ashritaha. That such people, their knowledge is stolen by illusion, their existence is lowest among the mankind, grossly foolish, and who partake the atheistic nature of the demons, they becomes completely disturbed by these pastimes, and for them, pastimes of the Lord is simply a headache because they are unable to understand. No, they do not know how the same Lord comes as Varaha avatar, and the same Lord is actually comes as Rama avatar. And the Krishna is son of Devaki or Yashoda, Nanda or Vasudev, where he is born in Goluk or Gokul or Golok or Vrindavan or Gokul or Mathura, and how Balaram's mother is Rohini, Krishna's mother is Devaki, and still they are both of the real brothers, and everything is just bewildering to such people. This is because they have not surrendered unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead or His devotees. Further, Srila Prabhupada says, and therefore it is advised for such people not to discuss the Lord's appearance and disappearance. Because more they discuss such pastimes, more they will commit offenses at the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. Because of their asuric nature, and more they will commit such activities, they will be gliding down to the hellish planets. Asurim yonimapanna, mudha janmani janmani. Right. So before one shloka before that, tanaham dvishataha kruran. Some such envious people, very, very dvisha, envy towards the Supreme Lord. Samsareshu naradhaman, kshipami ajasra shubhan, asurishu eva yonishu. That such people, they simply glide down to the hellish planet and becomes very, very difficult for them. So such people, and therefore this is the reason why the transcendental glories of the holy name or the Supreme Lord are not to be discussed publicly, because in general people are ignorant about the personality of Godhead, and people are ignorant about the pastimes of the Supreme Lord, divinity of the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada says, anyone who is against the transcendental living service is more or less a beastly creature, Dvipad Pashu, as confirmed in Srimad Bhagavatam. So one is simply existing for Ahar, Nidra, Bhaya, Ityadi, and one is envious, extreme envy. So such people are called as Dvipad Pashu, and for them, pastimes of the Lord are simply a mental disturbance. Right. So next verse, very, very beautiful verse. We'll recite this one. Atmanam च कुरु श्रेष्ठ
आत्मानं च कुरु श्रेष्ठ
कृष्णेन मनसेक्षितम्
कृष्णेन
Krishna
मनसेक्षितं
ध्यायन् गते भागवते
ध्यायन् गते भागवते
रुरोद प्रेम विह्वलः.
रोद प्रेम विह्वलम्
Translation.
Understanding that he was remembered by Lord Krishna while quitting this world, Vidura began to cry loudly, overwhelmed by the ecstasy of love. Purport: Vidura was overwhelmed by the ecstasy of love when he understood that Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, thought of him at the last moment. Although he thought of himself as insignificant, he was remembered by the Lord, by his causeless mercy. Vidura accepted this as a great favor, and thus he cried. This crying is the last word in the progressive path of devotional service. One who can cry for the Lord in love is certainly successful in the line of devotional service. Hare Krishna.
Atmanam च कुरु श्रेष्ठ कृष्णेन मनसेक्षितं ध्यायन् गते भागवते रुरोद प्रेम विह्वलः. Very, very beautiful words. Now, Uddhava and Vidura, they are concluding their samvad. And Uddhava also told Vidura that, my dear Vidura, before departing, the Supreme Lord intensely remembered you. Understanding that he was remembered by Lord Krishna while quitting this world and concluding his pastimes, Vidura was overwhelmed with intense separation from the Lord, and he began to cry loudly, Ruro the prema vivvala, overwhelmed by ecstasy of love. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada writes that Vidura was overwhelmed when he understood that Lord Krishna thought of him at the last moment. So, Ante Narayana Smriti, that one has to think of the Lord at the time of one's departure. But here, the Supreme Lord, when he is concluding his pastimes, he is thinking of his devotee. And Vidura felt, who am I? I'm just a Dasiputra. And, considering oneself to be extremely insignificant, Vidura, and when he realized that Supreme Lord remembered me, then he was overwhelmed with deep affection and love for the Supreme Lord. And Vidura accepted this as a great favor and began to cry loudly, Ruro the Prema Vibhala. And Srila Prabhupada says, this crying is the last word in the progressive path of devotional service. This crying is not to be practiced. as is done by Sahajiyas. They will simply practice crying. Just like you have a Hasya club, people practice laughing. Like that, there are people in Vrindavan and other places. There are people who practice crying also. They simply cry for Krishna. But this is not to be practiced crying. One has to perform one's duty in devotional service extremely well, just like Vidura performed the lifetime of devotional service, his activities very well, and at the same time being a devotee of the Lord. So one has to be a practicing sadhaka for a lifetime and then beg for the mercy of the Lord, and eventually one will cry, Ruroda Prema Vivvala. And Prabhupada says, one who can cry for the Lord in love is certainly successful in the line of devotional service. But this crying has to come with very intense devotional service, to begin with. This is not to be practiced, but this is to be causelessly achieved as a favor of the Supreme Lord. The last verse of this chapter, text 36. कालिन्द्यां कतिभिः सिद्ध अहोभिः भरत ऋषभ प्रापद्यत स्वसरितं यत्र मित्रासुतः मुनिः. Translation.
Passing a few
After
days on the
passing a
bank
few
of
days on the
river
bank of the
Yamuna,
river Yamuna,
Vidura,
Vidura,
the self-realizing soul, reaches the bank of the Ganges, where the great sages Martya was situated. Mitarya was situated.
Maitreya.
Yeah. So now, Kalindya Katibi. So this is happening on the banks of Yamuna. After passing a few days on the banks of river Yamuna, Vidura, the self-realized soul, reached the banks of Ganga, where the great sage Maitreya was situated. So Uddhava, he was reluctant to accept Vidura as his disciple. One was, by the age standard, he was of his father's age. Second was, he was himself overwhelmed with separation from the Supreme Lord, unable to speak. And third is, he thought that such a great personality as Maitreya, who understood the same message when Lord Krishna was delivering the message along with Uddhava, there was also Maitreya, and this sage Maitreya was very nearby. So Uddhava felt Maryada Vyatikrama, that would better Vidura approaches Maitreya, and for this, and he departed to Badrikashram, and Vidura he started towards on the banks of Ganga. And look at the beauty here is that this entire chapter is named as Vidura approaches Maitreya, right? And Vidura approaching Maitreya is the last verse in this chapter. So this is the last shloka. An entire chapter is named on the last shloka. So what is the learning here is that progressive devotional service, right? How we conclude devotional service is far more important than how we start our devotional service. Okay. So everybody has a story how they became a devotee. At the same time, one has to become more and more established because concluding is more important than just starting. Of course, starting is also very important. And this is how this chapter is named as Vidura approaches Maitreya. The same, the Bhaktivedanta purport of the third canto, fourth chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Vidura approaches Maitreya. So thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Gaura Bhakta
Jai.
ki jai. Thank you,
Jai.
Prabhupada.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, everyone.
Prabhupada.
Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Thank you,
Prabhuji.
Prabhupada.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Prabhupada.
Prabhuji.
Thank you,
Hare Krishna.
Prabhupada. Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhupada. Thank you,
Thank
Prabhuji.
you, Prabhupada. Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhupada. Thank you, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna. Tapan Prabhu, you have that announcement to make that this is live on, not live, at least this is available on YouTube. I think Tapan Prabhu is dropped. Thank you, Prabhupada.